The mansion stood like a glowing jewel against the Chicago night sky. Every window blazed with light and luxury cars lined the circular driveway, dropping off guests in designer gowns and tailored suits. Inside, the ballroom was something out of a fairy tale. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting dancing reflections across the polished marble floor. White-clothed tables surrounded a large open space where people mingled, champagne glasses in hand, their laughter mixing with soft conversation. This was the kind of party most people only see in movies. The guest list read like a who's who of Chicago's wealthiest families. Business owners, lawyers, doctors, and old-money socialites filled the room. They wore jewelry that could pay off a mortgage, and watches that cost more than most cars. The air smelled of expensive perfume and the elaborate floral arrangements that decorated every corner. Tonight was special. Richard Wellington was celebrating his 60th birthday, and he'd spared no expense. Waiters moved through the crowd like synchronized dancers, their trays perfectly balanced with champagne flutes and fancy appetizers that had names most people couldn't pronounce. An ice sculpture of a swan slowly melted in the corner, drops of water catching the light like diamonds. Among the servers was a woman named Carmen Rodriguez. She moved quietly through the crowd, her black and white uniform pressed and clean, her dark hair pulled back in a neat bun. At 52 years old, Carmen had worked enough of these high-end parties to know the routine by heart. Smile politely, keep your eyes down, refill glasses before they're empty, and above all, stay invisible. Carmen had been doing catering work for almost 3 years now. Before that, well, that was a different life. A life that felt so far away it might as well have belonged to someone else. Now she worked 4, sometimes 5 events a week, whatever she could get. The pay wasn't great, but it kept the lights on in her small apartment. Barely. Her feet ached in the sensible black shoes she wore. She'd been on them for 5 hours already, and the party showed no signs of slowing down. But Carmen didn't complain. She never complained. She just kept moving, kept serving, kept that small professional smile on her face even when guests looked right through her as if she wasn't there. "Excuse me, could we get more of those shrimp things?" a woman in a red dress asked, barely glancing at Carmen. "Of course, right away," Carmen said, heading back toward the kitchen. The kitchen was controlled chaos. Chefs shouted orders, ovens beeped, and platters of food moved in and out like an assembly line. Carmen grabbed a fresh tray and headed back out, weaving through the crowd with practiced ease. As she worked, she couldn't help but notice the massive grand piano sitting in the corner of the ballroom. It was a beautiful instrument, black and gleaming under the lights. A Steinway, if she wasn't mistaken. The kind of piano that cost as much as a house. It sat there like a sleeping giant, waiting for someone to bring it to life. Carmen felt something tighten in her chest when she looked at it. She quickly turned away, focusing on her work. That part of her life was over. Done. There was no point in thinking about it. Richard Wellington stood up then, tapping his champagne glass with a knife to get everyone's attention. The room gradually quieted down, all eyes turning to the birthday man. He was a tall man with silver hair, and the kind of presence that came from a lifetime of confidence and success. "Thank you all for coming tonight," he began, his voice carrying easily across the room. "I'm not one for long speeches, but I do want to say how grateful I am to have such wonderful friends and family here to celebrate with me." People applauded politely. Richard smiled and continued. "Now I had a special surprise planned for tonight. I hired what I'm told is the finest classical pianist in the city to perform for us." He paused and his smile faltered slightly. "Unfortunately, he called this afternoon with terrible laryngitis. Well, wrong ailment for a pianist, but you understand. He's quite ill and couldn't make it." A collective disappointed murmur rippled through the crowd. People glanced at the silent piano. I know," Richard said with a self-deprecating laugh. "I'd play myself, but trust me, you don't want that." "I can barely manage chopsticks," more laughter from the guests. "So we'll have to make do with recorded music through the speakers." "Not quite the same, but what can you do?" Carmen was standing near the kitchen door when she heard this. Her eyes drifted back to the piano, that beautiful, perfect instrument sitting silent. What a waste. Her fingers tingled with muscle memory, remembering the feel of ivory keys, the weight of them under her touch. She shook her head slightly, forcing the thoughts away, and went back to work. The party continued. People ate and drank and laughed. Richard's daughter, a woman in her 30s named Jennifer, stood with her brother near the piano. Carmen passed by them as she collected empty glasses from a nearby table. "Dad's disappointed," Jennifer was saying quietly. "He was really looking forward to the live music. You know how much he loves classical piano." "I know," her brother replied. "He's been talking about it for weeks. Wanted it to be perfect. He spent months planning every detail of tonight," Jennifer continued. "And the one thing he was most excited about falls through." Carmen's hands trembled slightly as she arranged glasses on her tray. Something about those words hit her differently than they should have. She thought about all the careful planning, all the hope for something special, all of it gone because of simple bad luck. She knew what that felt like. She finished collecting the glasses and turned to head back to the kitchen. But as she walked, she found her feet slowing down. She glanced back at the piano one more time. The light hit it just right, making it almost seem to glow. Carmen felt her heart beating faster. This was crazy. This was absolutely insane. She was a waitress. She was here to serve drinks and clear plates, not to. But then again, what was the worst that could happen? They'd say no. They'd probably laugh. They'd think she was ridiculous, presumptuous, completely out of line. But that piano, that beautiful piano sitting silent all night long. During her next break, Carmen did something she'd never done before at one of these events. She approached one of the guests. Not just any guest. She walked up to Jennifer, who was standing alone for a moment looking at her phone. "Excuse me," Carmen said, her voice barely above a whisper. She had to clear her throat and try again. "Excuse me, miss?" Jennifer looked up, surprised to be addressed by one of the servers. "I'm sorry to bother you," Carmen continued, her heart pounding so hard she was sure Jennifer could hear it. "I overheard you talking about the pianist who couldn't come tonight." Jennifer's expression was polite but puzzled. "Yes?" Carmen's mouth went dry. What was she doing? This was a mistake. But she'd already started, and somehow she couldn't stop now. "I know this is going to sound strange," Carmen said, her hands clasped together to keep them from shaking. "And I completely understand if you say no. But I wanted to ask," she took a breath. "Would it be possible for me to play? Just one piece, if you'd allow it." Jennifer stared at her for a long moment. Carmen could see the confusion in her eyes, probably mixed with a bit of pity. Here was the help asking to entertain the guests. It must have seemed absurd, but before Jennifer could respond, one of the other servers walked by. He'd apparently overheard Carmen's request because he barely stifled a laugh. The sound made Carmen's cheeks burn with embarrassment. "You play piano?" Jennifer asked, her tone careful, not unkind but clearly skeptical. "I used to," Carmen said quietly. "A long time ago." Jennifer looked at her father across the room, then back at Carmen. Carmen could see her weighing the decision, probably thinking about how strange it would be, how her father's wealthy friends might react. But she could also see something else in Jennifer's face. Maybe curiosity, maybe kindness. "All right," Jennifer finally said. "Why not? Dad would be happy to have any music at all." "Let me tell him." Carmen's hands went to her apron, fingers trembling as she untied it. Jennifer walked across the ballroom toward her father, and Carmen watched her go, suddenly wondering if she'd just made the biggest mistake of her evening. Or maybe of her life. What had she been thinking? These people didn't want to hear some waitress play piano. They wanted a professional, someone with credentials, someone who belonged in their world. Carmen's co-worker, the one who'd laughed, came up beside her. "You're serious about this?" he asked, shaking his head. "Carmen, these people are brutal. If you mess up, they'll tear you apart." "I know," Carmen said quietly, though her stomach was twisting into knots. "Then why would you volunteer for that?" he asked, genuinely confused. Carmen didn't have a good answer. She just looked at the piano again, at its perfect keys waiting to be played. And something inside her ached with a longing she'd tried to bury for 3 long years. Across the room, Jennifer was talking to her father. Carmen could see Richard's face light up with surprise, then interest. He glanced over at Carmen, and she quickly looked down at her hands. They were rough now, not like they used to be. Years of washing dishes and carrying heavy trays had taken their toll. She wondered if they could even still play the way they once did. Richard was nodding now, saying something to his daughter. Then Jennifer was walking back, and Carmen's heart hammered against her ribs. "He says yes," Jennifer told her with a small smile. He's actually excited about it. Are you sure you want to do this? No, Carmen thought. I'm not sure at all. Yes, she said out loud. Jennifer touched her arm gently. Wait just a moment. Let me have him announce it properly. Richard Wellington moved to the center of the room again, raising his glass. The conversations died down once more, people turning their attention to their host. Ladies and gentlemen, Richard said, his voice warm and pleased. I have some unexpected good news. One of our wonderful catering staff has graciously offered to play for us tonight. Let's give her our attention and appreciation. There was polite applause, but Carmen could hear the murmurs underneath it. She could see the raised eyebrows, the skeptical glances. As she walked across the ballroom toward the piano, she heard the whispers start. The waitress is going to play? Is this some kind of joke? How embarrassing for Richard. This should be interesting. Someone actually laughed, trying to cover it with a cough. Carmen's face grew hot, but she kept walking. Each step felt like moving through water. The distance to the piano seemed impossibly far. Then suddenly she was there, standing beside it, and everyone was looking at her. She could feel their eyes on her uniform, on her worn shoes, on the way her hands trembled slightly as she reached up to adjust the piano bench. The woman in the red dress who'd asked for shrimp earlier was standing near the front, a smirk on her face as she whispered something to the man beside her. He grinned in response. Carmen sat down on the bench. The leather was soft, expensive. Her back straight out of old habit, her feet finding the pedals instinctively. She looked at the keys, black and white, perfectly aligned. How long had it been? 3 years since she'd touched a piano. 3 years since that night when she'd sold her own Steinway to pay for her husband Miguel's final medical bills. The cancer had taken everything. Not just Miguel, but their savings, their home, their future. The piano had been the last thing to go, and it had broken something in Carmen that she didn't know how to fix. Music had been her life, her identity, her purpose. Without it, she was just going through the motions of existing. But before that, before Miguel's illness, there had been another loss. Their son, Danny. Sweet, bright Danny, who'd been killed by a drunk driver when he was just 17. Carmen had been a concert pianist then, touring, performing, living her dream. After Danny died, she couldn't play anymore. Couldn't perform. Every note reminded her of what she'd lost, of the future her son would never have, of all the concerts he'd never attend. She'd taken 15 years away from music, 15 years of silence. Then Miguel got sick and she started playing again just for him, just in their living room. Soft pieces that helped him sleep when the pain was bad. It had helped them both heal a little. They'd been planning for her to perform again, to try to rebuild that part of her life. Then Miguel died, and the medical bills came and the piano went, and with it, Carmen's last connection to who she used to be. And now she sat at this beautiful instrument, in front of these wealthy strangers who thought she was nobody, and her hands hovered over the keys. Any time now, someone said, not quite quietly enough. More nervous laughter rippled through the crowd. Carmen closed her eyes. She blocked out the room, blocked out the whispers and the judgment and the fear. She thought about Miguel, about how he'd believed in her even when she'd stopped believing in herself. She thought about Danny, about how he used to sit beside her when she practiced, completely entranced by the music. She took a deep breath and let her fingers drop to the keys. The first notes of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 filled the ballroom like a wave of pure emotion. Rich, powerful, sweeping notes that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside the instrument, from somewhere deep inside Carmen herself. The laughter stopped instantly. Carmen didn't notice. She was somewhere else now, somewhere beyond that ballroom and those people. Her hands moved across the keys with a certainty and grace that seemed impossible after 3 years away. But music isn't something you forget. It lives in your bones, in your muscle memory, in the deepest part of who you are. The piece was technically demanding, full of complex runs and powerful chords, but Carmen played it flawlessly, more than flawlessly. She played it with the kind of feeling that transforms notes on a page into something that reaches inside your chest and squeezes your heart. In the audience, faces that had been smirking were now slack with shock. Champagne glasses hung forgotten in hands. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the staff in the back of the room stopped what they were doing and turned to listen. Jennifer stood frozen, her phone still in her hand. She'd been about to record a video, expecting something awkward or amateur that might be cute to show her friends later. Instead, she was witnessing something extraordinary. Her hand started shaking and she nearly dropped her phone. Richard Wellington's mouth had fallen open. He'd been a patron of the arts for decades, had attended countless professional concerts at Symphony Hall, had heard some of the world's finest pianists. But this woman, this waitress in the uniform with the tired eyes, was playing with a depth of emotion that made his chest tight. The piece was building now, growing more intense. Carmen's whole body moved with the music, swaying slightly, her fingers flying across the keys so fast they blurred. Sweat beaded on her forehead, but she didn't notice. Tears were starting to stream down her face, but she didn't wipe them away. This wasn't just performance. This was grief being transformed into something beautiful. This was 3 years of silence being broken. This was every moment of loss and pain and struggle being poured into the keys, channeled through the strings and hammers of the piano, emerging as something that transcended all of it. A woman near the back of the crowd started crying, though she couldn't have explained why. She didn't even particularly like classical music. But something in what she was hearing moved her in a way she hadn't expected, in a way she couldn't resist. Jennifer, still standing near the front, suddenly remembered her phone. With shaking hands, she opened her browser and typed in a search. Carmen Rodriguez, pianist. She hit enter, not really expecting to find anything. Maybe some local community center performances, maybe some church recitals. What came up made her gasp out loud. Pages of results, concert programs, reviews, articles from 15 years ago about a rising star in the classical music world. Carmen Rodriguez, the young virtuoso who'd performed at Carnegie Hall. Carmen Rodriguez, who'd toured internationally. Carmen Rodriguez, who'd been called one of the most promising pianists of her generation. Jennifer scrolled frantically through the articles, her heart pounding. Then she found the ones from later. About the tragedy. About Carmen's son being killed. About her withdrawal from the music world. She kept searching, finding more recent articles, sparse and brief. About her husband's death from cancer. About medical debt. About a Steinway piano being sold at auction. "Oh my God," Jennifer whispered. She looked up at Carmen, who was still playing, still lost in the music, tears streaming down her face. Jennifer started moving through the crowd, showing her phone to people near her. Her brother, her best friend, her father's business partner. "Look," she kept saying. "Look who she is." The information spread like wildfire. People pulled out their own phones, searching, reading, sharing. The knowledge moved through the ballroom in whispers that grew increasingly amazed, increasingly ashamed. This wasn't just some waitress who happened to know how to play piano. This was a real artist, someone who'd achieved what most musicians only dream of, someone who'd lost everything and ended up here, serving them champagne, invisible and overlooked. And they'd laughed at her. The man who'd made the joke about any time now felt his face burning with shame. The woman in the red dress had tears running down her cheeks, ruining her makeup, and for once she didn't care. Carmen transitioned into a softer section of the piece, and the mood in the room shifted with it. The powerful, sweeping emotions gave way to something more tender, more intimate. It was like being allowed into someone's private grief, their private memory of love. Carmen's fingers moved through the melody like water flowing over stones. Each note perfectly placed, perfectly timed, perfectly felt. The Rachmaninoff was reaching its most technically challenging section now, the part where most pianists had to concentrate so hard on the mechanics that the emotion sometimes got lost. But Carmen wasn't thinking about technique. She wasn't thinking about anything except the music itself and the memories it carried. She remembered the first time she'd learned this piece. She'd been 23, studying at a conservatory, and her teacher had told her she wasn't ready for it. "Too young," he'd said. "Too inexperienced. You need to have lived more life to understand what Rachmaninoff was trying to say." She'd been insulted at the time, determined to prove him wrong. Now at 52, with a lifetime of joy and heartbreak behind her, she finally understood what he'd meant. This piece wasn't just about playing the right notes in the right order. It was about channeling something deeper, something that couldn't be taught in any music school. It was about taking all the broken pieces of your life and arranging them into something that made sense, something that mattered. Her hands crossed over each other in a complicated passage, the left hand playing a melody in the upper register, while the right hand filled in harmonies below. She'd practiced this crossover thousands of times in her younger years, but her hands found it now as if no time had passed at all. Muscle memory was a strange and wonderful thing. In the audience, Richard Wellington had quietly moved closer to the piano. He stood about 10 feet away, transfixed. He'd been a lover of classical music his entire adult life, had donated millions to the symphony over the years, had a collection of recordings that filled an entire wall of his study. But he'd never heard anything quite like this. The raw honesty of it, the way it seemed to reach inside his chest and touch something he'd forgotten was there. He thought about his own life, his own losses. His wife had died 5 years ago, a sudden heart attack that had left him reeling. His children thought he'd moved on, that he was fine, but there were still nights when he woke up reaching for her, forgetting for a split second that she was gone. This music understood that. This music spoke to that. Jennifer was now standing beside her father, tears streaming down her face. She'd shown him the articles on her phone, the information about who Carmen really was. He'd read them with growing astonishment, then looked back at the woman playing, seeing her completely differently now. Not as invisible help, as a person with a story. As an artist who'd somehow ended up here in this moment, giving them a gift they didn't deserve. The softer section was ending now, and the piece was building again. Carmen's foot pressed harder on the sustain pedal, letting the notes ring out and blend together, creating layers of sound that seemed to fill every corner of the massive ballroom. The chandelier crystals caught the vibrations and trembled slightly, adding their own tiny notes to the music. A waiter near the kitchen door had tears streaming down his face. He was young, maybe 25, working his way through community college. He'd never been to a classical concert in his life, had always thought that kind of music was boring, something only rich old people pretended to like. But this was different. This was reaching him in a way he couldn't explain, making him feel things he didn't have words for. Carmen's co-worker, the one who'd laughed at her earlier, was standing in the back, his arms crossed over his chest. But his eyes were wet and his throat was tight. He felt ashamed now, ashamed of his laughter, his judgment, his assumption that he knew anything about this woman he'd worked beside for months without really seeing her. The piece was approaching its most powerful moment. The section where the melody soars above crashing chords, where everything Rachmaninoff had to say about longing and loss and the bittersweet beauty of memory, comes together in one overwhelming crescendo. Carmen's whole body tensed as she prepared for it, her shoulders rising. Her breath held. Then her hands came down on the keys with tremendous force, pulling sound from the piano that seemed almost too big for the instrument. The notes crashed over the crowd like waves, powerful and relentless and achingly beautiful. Women who'd arrived in designer gowns were now dabbing at their eyes with cocktail napkins. Men in expensive suits were blinking hard, trying to compose themselves. Carmen was crying openly now, but she didn't slow down. If anything, she played with even more intensity, more abandon. This was what she'd been holding back for 3 years. This was everything she'd been too afraid to feel, too tired to process, too broken to express. But music had always been her language, the way she spoke when words weren't enough. And right now she was saying everything. She thought about Miguel, about the way he'd looked at her the last time she played for him. He'd been so weak by then, could barely keep his eyes open, but he'd smiled. "There's my Carmen," he'd whispered. I was wondering when she'd come back. He'd died 2 days later, and Carmen had thought that was it. That part of her life, that part of herself had died with him. But here she was, playing, really playing. Not just going through the motions, not just hitting the right notes, but pouring her soul into the music the way she used to, the way she'd thought she never would again. Jennifer was recording on her phone now, her hands still shaking so badly that the video was probably unusable. She didn't care. She just wanted to capture this somehow, to have proof that it had really happened. Around her, other people were doing the same thing, phones held up, trying to document something that was already slipping away even as it happened. Richard caught his daughter's eye and mouthed, "Who is she?" Even though Jennifer had already told him, had shown him the articles, he couldn't quite believe it. This woman had been here all evening, serving his guests, invisible in her uniform. How many other times had she worked at his house? How many parties had she catered where no one saw her as anything more than the help? The piece was building toward its conclusion now, but Carmen wasn't ready to let it go yet. She extended certain passages, holding notes longer than written, taking liberties with the tempo that would have made her old teachers frown. But this wasn't a concert hall, and she wasn't performing for critics. This was something else entirely. Something more personal, more necessary. A woman near the front, someone who'd whispered a snide comment when Carmen first sat down, was now openly sobbing. She'd been going through a divorce, something she'd been trying to hide from their social circle, trying to pretend everything was fine. But this music had reached through all her careful defenses and touched the raw wound underneath. She felt exposed and relieved all at once. The young waiter in the back thought about his mother, who'd died when he was 16. He hadn't cried at her funeral, had been too shocked, too numb. But he was crying now, finally grieving in a way he hadn't been able to then. Music had opened a door he didn't know he'd kept closed. Carmen's hands were aching now. 3 years away from regular practice meant her stamina wasn't what it used to be. Her shoulders burned with tension. Her back screamed in protest. Her fingers felt like they might cramp at any moment. But she pushed through it. She had to finish this. Had to see it through to the end. The final section was approaching. The part where the melody returns one last time, transformed, sadder and wiser and somehow more beautiful for everything it's been through. Carmen slowed down slightly, letting each note hang in the air, giving them space to breathe and resonate. The crowd was completely silent except for the occasional sniffle or quiet sob. Even the kitchen staff had stopped working entirely, drawn out by the music to stand in doorways and corners listening. The chef, a gruff man who prided himself on never showing emotion, had tears in his eyes. Carmen played the final melody with a tenderness that made hearts ache. It was like a lullaby, like a goodbye, like a promise. Her fingers moved gently over the keys now, coaxing out sounds so soft and pure they seemed almost fragile. The tears on her face were drying, leaving tracks in her makeup, but new ones kept falling to replace them. She thought about Danny, about the little boy who used to climb into her lap while she practiced, who'd fall asleep to the sound of scales and etudes. She thought about teaching him to play Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star when he was 5. How proud he'd been when he finally got it right. She thought about the pieces she'd never play for him, the concerts he'd never attend, all the music they'd never share. But she also thought about the joy he'd found in listening, the way music had connected them in a way that went beyond words, that was still there, still real even though he was gone. Miguel used to tell her that love doesn't die just because people do. It changes form, but it doesn't disappear. Music was like that too. The piece was ending now, truly ending. Carmen played the final chords with a mixture of sorrow and acceptance, each note a small goodbye. The last chord hung in the air, sustained by the pedal, slowly fading until finally, there was silence. The silence that followed was absolute. Not a glass clinked, not a breath was audible, not a single person moved. It was as if the entire ballroom had been frozen in time, suspended in the space between what had just happened and whatever would come next. Carmen sat at the piano bench, her hands still resting on the keys, her eyes closed, completely drained. She'd forgotten where she was for a moment. Forgotten the mansion, the wealthy guests, the uniform she wore. She'd been somewhere else entirely, lost in the music and the memories it carried. Now slowly reality was seeping back in. She became aware of the hard bench beneath her, the ache in her shoulders, the wetness on her cheeks. And then the silence broke. Richard Wellington started clapping. Just him at first, his hands coming together in slow, deliberate applause that echoed through the ballroom like thunder. Then his daughter joined him, then the man beside her. Then suddenly everyone was on their feet, applauding so loudly it seemed to shake the chandelier above them. But this wasn't the polite golf clap you hear at charity galas, or the obligatory applause at the end of a performance. This was raw and genuine and overwhelming. People were still crying as they clapped, mascara running, faces red, completely unself-conscious in their emotion. The sound rolled over Carmen like another wave, and she finally opened her eyes. What she saw shocked her. Every single person in that ballroom was standing, applauding, many of them openly weeping. These sophisticated, controlled, wealthy people who prided themselves on their composure had been completely undone. The woman in the red dress was sobbing so hard her shoulders shook. The man who'd made the snide comment was wiping his eyes with his sleeve, not even caring how it looked. Carmen stood up on shaky legs, not sure what to do. She'd performed for audiences before, of course, back in her other life. But this felt different. These people weren't applauding her technical skill or her interpretation of the piece. They were thanking her for something deeper, something she didn't fully understand herself. Richard Wellington walked toward her, and the crowd parted to let him through. His face was wet with tears and he made no attempt to hide it. When he reached Carmen, he did something that shocked everyone in the room, including himself. He pulled her into a tight embrace. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Thank you." Carmen stood stiffly in his arms, completely overwhelmed. This wasn't how things were supposed to work. The hired help didn't get hugged by the host, but Richard held on for another moment before releasing her, his hands on her shoulders, looking at her like he was really seeing her for the first time. "That was extraordinary," he said, loud enough for people nearby to hear. "Absolutely extraordinary." Jennifer appeared at her father's side, her phone still clutched in her hand. "Dad," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Do you know who she is?" Richard looked at his daughter, confused. Jennifer turned to Carmen. "May I tell them?" she asked gently. "About your history?" Carmen felt panic flutter in her chest. Her history. Her old life. The life she'd left behind. Or maybe the life that had left her behind. She wasn't sure she wanted these people to know. It felt too exposing, too vulnerable. But Jennifer's eyes were kind, not intrusive. And somehow Carmen found herself nodding. Jennifer turned back to the crowd, many of whom had moved closer, drawn by curiosity and the magnitude of what they'd just witnessed. She held up her phone, showing the screen to those nearby. "Her name is Carmen Rodriguez," Jennifer began, her voice carrying across the room. 15 years ago, she was one of the most promising concert pianists in the country. She performed at Carnegie Hall. She toured internationally. Critics called her a once-in-a-generation talent. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. People pulled out their own phones, searching, finding the same articles Jennifer had discovered. Carmen watched them, feeling exposed and strange as they read about her past. But then tragedy struck. Jennifer continued, her voice softer now. Her 17-year-old son was killed by a drunk driver. Carmen stopped performing entirely. She stepped away from music for 15 years. The room had gone quiet again. People were looking at Carmen with new eyes now, understanding beginning to dawn. The young waiter in the back felt his chest tighten. 17, the same age he'd been when his mother died. "A few years ago, she started playing again," Jennifer went on. She was preparing to return to performing. But then her husband was diagnosed with cancer. The medical bills were crushing. To pay for his treatment, Carmen sold everything, including her piano. A Steinway that she'd owned since the beginning of her career. The woman in the red dress let out a small sob. She thought about her own grand piano at home, the one she'd bought for her daughter's lessons, the one that mostly sat unused. She couldn't imagine having to sell it, couldn't imagine that kind of desperation. Her husband passed away 3 years ago, Jennifer finished quietly. Since then, Carmen has been working catering jobs to make ends meet. She paused, looking around at the assembled guests. She served us champagne tonight. Most of us probably didn't even notice her. We looked right through her. The shame in the room was palpable. People who'd laughed when Carmen sat down at the piano couldn't meet each other's eyes. The man who'd made the "anytime now" comment felt sick to his stomach. How many times had he done this? Looked at service workers as if they were invisible, as if they didn't have stories, didn't have histories, didn't have dreams they'd had to set aside. Richard turned back to Carmen, and there were fresh tears on his face. "I'm so sorry," he said. "For your losses, for—" He gestured vaguely at the room, at the situation. "For not seeing you." Carmen shook her head. "You have nothing to apologize for," she said quietly. "I'm just the catering staff. I'm not supposed to be seen." "No," Richard said firmly. "That's wrong. That's fundamentally wrong, and I'm ashamed that I've thought that way." Jennifer stepped forward, putting a gentle hand on Carmen's arm. "Why did you volunteer to play?" she asked. "After everything, after 3 years away from it, why tonight?" Carmen looked at the piano, at the instrument that had given her so much joy and so much pain over the years. "I heard you say your father had been planning this for months," she said finally, "that he'd been looking forward to the live music. And I saw that beautiful piano sitting there silent, and it just seemed wrong, wasteful." She paused, choosing her words carefully, and maybe I needed to know if I could still do it. If music was still there inside me, or if I'd lost it completely. "And?" Jennifer prompted gently. Carmen smiled, a small, sad, complicated smile. "It's still there," she whispered. Richard was looking at Carmen with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. She could see him thinking, processing, coming to some kind of decision. Finally, he spoke. "What are you doing next Tuesday?" he asked. Carmen blinked, confused by the question. "Working," she said. "I have a shift at a corporate lunch downtown." "Cancel it," Richard said. "I want to hire you for something." "Properly hire you, I mean, not as catering staff, you know." "Mr. Wellington, Please," he interrupted. "Hear me out. I own a music venue downtown. The Blue Note, have you heard of it?" Carmen nodded. Of course she'd heard of it. It was one of the premier jazz and classical venues in Chicago. The kind of place she used to dream of performing at in her younger years. "We have an open slot next Tuesday evening," Richard continued. "One of our regular performers had to cancel. I'd like you to fill it. A full concert, whatever pieces you want to play. We'll pay you, of course. The standard rate we pay all our performers." Carmen stared at him. "I haven't practiced," she said. "I haven't performed in years. I can't just—" "You just did," Richard interrupted gently. "You just performed for a room full of people, and it was the most moving musical experience of my life. And I've been attending concerts for 40 years. He's right," Jennifer added. "What we just heard was incredible. Not despite your years away, but maybe because of them. You've lived. You've suffered. And that's in your music now in a way it couldn't have been before." Carmen's mind was reeling. A concert. A real concert. At a real venue. The possibility of it filled her with equal parts terror and longing. "I don't know if I can," she whispered. "Will you think about it?" Richard asked. "Please." Before Carmen could answer, another voice spoke up from the crowd. It was the woman in the red dress, stepping forward with determination in her eyes despite the mascara streaks on her cheeks. "I'd like to help too," she said. "I'm Victoria Chen. I run a foundation that supports artists in need." She pulled a business card from her small clutch. "Please contact me. We have programs that might benefit you. Grants, resources, connections to music schools if you're interested in teaching." Another person stepped forward, an older man with white hair. "I'm a music critic for the Tribune," he said. "I'd like to write about you. About your story. If you're comfortable with that." "I teach at the conservatory," a woman in her 50s added. "We're always looking for visiting artists. Guest performers. Someone with your experience, your story, could be incredibly valuable to our students." More people were coming forward now, offering help, offering connections, offering opportunities. Carmen felt dizzy with it all. An hour ago she'd been invisible, just another server weaving through the crowd. Now she was surrounded by people who wanted to help her, to lift her up, to bring her back to the world of music she'd thought was lost forever. "I don't understand," Carmen said, her voice shaky. "Why would you all do this?" "You don't know me." "Because," Richard said simply, "you gave us something precious tonight, something money can't buy. You reminded us what music is supposed to be, what it's supposed to do, and maybe," he added more quietly, "you reminded us to see people, really see them." The young waiter in the back was crying again, but this time they were different tears, hopeful tears. He thought maybe, just maybe, the world wasn't quite as hard and cold as he'd believed. Maybe there was still kindness in it, still possibilities for second chances. Carmen stood there surrounded by all these people, their business cards being pressed into her hands, their voices overlapping with offers and promises, and she felt something close to panic rising in her chest. It was too much, too fast, too overwhelming. Part of her wanted to run, to go back to the kitchen, back to the safety of being invisible, back to the simple routine of serving and clearing and staying in the background where life couldn't hurt her anymore. But another part of her, a part she'd thought was dead, was waking up. It was small and hesitant and scared, but it was there. Hope. Actual, genuine hope. The kind she hadn't felt in 3 years, maybe longer. Jennifer seemed to sense her overwhelm. She gently took Carmen's elbow and guided her away from the crowd, toward a quieter corner of the ballroom. Richard followed, and the three of them stood together in a small bubble of relative calm. "I know this is a lot," Jennifer said kindly, "and you don't have to decide anything tonight. But my father's offer is genuine. The venue, next Tuesday. Will you at least think about it?" Carmen looked at the piano, still sitting there like a patient friend waiting for her return. "What would I even play?" she asked, more to herself than to them. "I'm so out of practice. My stamina is gone. My fingers aren't what they used to be." "Your fingers just played Rachmaninoff flawlessly," Richard pointed out gently. I think you're being harder on yourself than you need to be. Carmen shook her head. That was different. I don't know what that was. It just happened. But a whole concert? Planning it, practicing, performing for people who paid money to be there? That's different. That's pressure. You've done it before, Jennifer reminded her. That was a lifetime ago, Carmen said. I'm not that person anymore. No, Richard agreed. You're not. You're someone who's survived incredible loss and kept going. You're someone who's worked hard, unglamorous jobs to keep a roof over your head. You're someone who just played one of the most difficult pieces in the classical repertoire after 3 years away from the piano and moved a room full of cynical, jaded people to tears. He paused. I'd argue you're more that person now than you ever were before. Carmen felt tears threatening again. She was so tired of crying. But these words, this unexpected kindness from strangers, it was breaking through defenses she'd built carefully over years. I'm scared, she admitted quietly. Of course you are, Jennifer said. But fear isn't always a reason not to do something. Sometimes it's just a sign that something matters. They stood in silence for a moment. Around them, the party was slowly resuming, though the energy had completely changed. People were talking quietly, sincerely, many of them still holding tissues, still processing what they'd experienced. The superficial chatter from earlier in the evening was gone. Something real had happened here, and it had shifted something in the room. Carmen's co-worker, the one who'd laughed at her, approached cautiously. His eyes were red and he looked genuinely ashamed. Carmen, he said, I'm sorry. For laughing. For not taking you seriously. I was a jerk. Carmen looked at him. This young man who worked alongside her most weeks, who she barely knew beyond shift schedules and small talk. It's okay, she said. No, it's not, he insisted. I judged you. I don't know what I thought. But I was wrong. We've all judged people, Carmen said tiredly. It's human nature. We make assumptions. We put people in boxes. It's easier that way. That doesn't make it right, he said. Then more quietly, that was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard, and I almost missed it because I'd already decided who you were. Carmen put a hand on his shoulder. You didn't miss it, she said. You were here. You listened. That's what matters. He nodded, still looking miserable, and walked away. Jennifer watched him go, then turned back to Carmen. You're very kind, she observed. Carmen shrugged. I've been on both sides of judgment. I know what it feels like to be dismissed, but I also know what it feels like to dismiss others. None of us are as good as we'd like to think we are. Richard's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, then showed the screen to his daughter. The video's already going viral, he said with amazement. Someone posted it online. It's got thousands of shares already. Carmen felt a jolt of alarm. What video? Of you playing, Jennifer explained. Several people recorded it. Someone must have posted it to social media. She paused, seeing Carmen's expression. Is that okay? Do you want us to ask them to take it down? Carmen didn't know what she wanted. Part of her hated the idea of being exposed like that, of strangers watching her most vulnerable moment. But another part wondered what it might mean. If people saw it, if word got out, if doors that had closed might crack open again. I don't know, she said honestly. Let me think about it. The evening was winding down now. Guests were starting to leave, but many of them made a point of finding Carmen before they left. They thanked her. They hugged her. They pressed business cards into her hands, urged her to call them, promised they meant it. The woman in the red dress, Victoria Chen, gave her a card and whispered, Please don't throw this away. I mean, what I said about the foundation, we can help. The music critic promised to be in touch, said he wanted to do a feature on her, on comeback stories, on art surviving tragedy. The conservatory professor invited her to lunch, said they should talk about possibilities. On and on it went until Carmen had a fistful of cards and a head spinning with possibilities. Finally, the last guest left. The catering company manager came over to Carmen looking both proud and confused. I don't even know what to say, he admitted. That was incredible. I had no idea you could do that. Neither did I, Carmen said quietly. Not anymore anyway. Do you need a ride home? He asked. Your shift is technically over. Carmen realized she was exhausted. Bone-deep, soul-tired exhausted. But it was different from the exhaustion she usually felt after these events. This was the exhaustion that comes from feeling too much, from opening yourself up after keeping yourself closed for so long. I'll give her a ride, Jennifer offered quickly. If that's okay? Carmen started to protest, but she didn't have the energy. She just nodded. The drive to Carmen's apartment was quiet at first. Jennifer seemed to sense that Carmen needed space to process. But as they got closer to the address Carmen had given, Jennifer finally spoke. I started a crowdfunding campaign, she said, while you were talking to people. I hope that's okay. I put up the story, linked to the videos, explained about your husband's medical bills, about everything you've been through. Carmen turned to look at her, shocked. You what? I know I should have asked first, Jennifer said quickly. And if you want me to take it down, I will. But Carmen, you need help. And people want to help. I've seen it work before. Seen how generous people can be when they understand someone's story. I don't want charity, Carmen said automatically, though even as she said it, she knew it wasn't entirely true. She did need help. She was drowning in debt, barely keeping her head above water. It's not charity, Jennifer said firmly. It's people recognizing something unjust and wanting to fix it. You're an artist. You should be performing, teaching, sharing your gift. Not working yourself to exhaustion serving champagne to people who don't even see you. She paused. That came out wrong. What I mean is, you deserve better, and people want to help make that possible. They pulled up to Carmen's apartment building. It was small, run down in a part of the city that had seen better days. Carmen felt a flash of shame that Jennifer was seeing where she lived, then pushed the feeling away. This was her reality. There was no point in being ashamed of it. Thank you for the ride, Carmen said quietly. Wait, Jennifer said. Before you go, promise me you'll think about Tuesday, about the concert. Even if you're scared, even if you're not sure, just promise me you'll think about it. Carmen looked at this young woman who'd been so kind to her, who'd seen her when others hadn't, who was trying so hard to help. I promise, she said finally. She got out of the car and walked to her building, feeling Jennifer's eyes on her until she was inside. The apartment was small and sparse. Most of her furniture had been sold years ago. She had a bed, a small table, a chair. The walls were bare. There was no piano, of course. That had been gone for 3 years. Carmen collapsed onto her bed, still in her uniform, too tired to even change. She thought about everything that had happened, everything that had changed in a single night. It felt surreal, like something that had happened to someone else. Her phone buzzed. Text messages were flooding in from people who'd gotten her number somehow. Words of encouragement, praise, offers to help. She turned the phone off, overwhelmed. But before she fell asleep, she allowed herself to think about Tuesday. About standing on a real stage again. About playing a full concert for an audience that had chosen to be there. The thought terrified her. But it also made her heart beat faster with something that felt dangerously like excitement. The next morning, Carmen woke to discover that Jennifer's crowdfunding campaign had raised $30,000 overnight. The video of her playing had been viewed over 1 million times. Her inbox was full of messages from journalists, musicians, venues wanting to book her, students wanting to study with her. She sat on her bed, staring at her phone in disbelief. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen. Not to people like her. Not after everything she'd lost, but it was real. And slowly, carefully, Carmen let herself believe it might be possible, that maybe her story wasn't over, that maybe there was a second act after all. On Tuesday evening, Carmen stood in the wings of the Blue Note, wearing a simple black dress that Jennifer had bought for her, her hands shaking as she waited for her introduction. The venue was packed. Every seat filled, people standing in the back. She could hear the murmur of the crowd, could feel the weight of their expectations. She thought about Miguel, about how proud he would have been. She thought about Danny, about how he used to tell his friends his mom was a famous pianist even when she wasn't performing anymore. She thought about the 3 years she'd spent in the shadows, invisible and safe, but only half alive.